On the 4th of April, 2025, a short notice appeared on the website of China's Ministry of Commerce. It did not declare war. It did not raise a tariff or move a single soldier. It simply added 7 elements to a list: samarium, gadolinium, terbium, dysprosium, lutetium, scandium, and yttrium, and announced that from now on, anyone who wanted to buy them from China would need a license. To almost everyone reading the news that week, it meant nothing. To the engineers who build fighter jets, guided missiles, wind turbines, and electric cars, it was one of the most consequential export decisions of the decade. Because those 7 names are not obscure trivia. They're the ingredients of the modern world's most powerful magnets. The magnets that let an F-35 stealth fighter move its control surfaces, that spin inside every electric motor, that keep a submarine's drive shaft turning. And more than 90% of the world's supply of them flows through a single country. When Beijing tightened the valve in April 2025, it was not blocking a commodity. It was reminding the planet who controls the shelf that everything else is built on. This is the strange truth at the center of the 21st century economy. The most important materials on Earth are not the ones we talk about. We argue about oil, about semiconductors, about lithium. But underneath all of it sits a quieter dependency. 17 metallic elements that almost no one can name, dug and refined overwhelmingly in one place, and increasingly used as a lever of power. They are called the rare earths. And the story of how one nation came to own them is not a story of luck. It is a story of strategy, decades in the making. To understand why a single customs notice can rattle defense ministries from Washington to Tokyo, you have to understand what these elements do, why they became a choke point, and how the rest of the world handed that choke point away, almost without noticing. You have to follow the ore out of a mountain in Inner Mongolia, through chemistry so difficult that few countries will attempt it, into the guts of the machines that run your life. And you have to ask the uncomfortable question that governments are only now waking up to. What happens to a modern economy when the supplier decides to stop supplying? That is what this video is about. Not a conspiracy, a supply chain. A slow, deliberate, and almost invisible accumulation of control built out of geology, chemistry, patience, and a willingness to bear costs that everyone else preferred to avoid. By the end, the phone in your hand, the car in your driveway, and the jet defending your airspace will look a little different. Because all 3 of them run on something you've probably never seen and cannot easily replace. Start with the name itself, because it is misleading. The rare earths are a set of 17 metallic elements. The 15 lanthanides that sit in that lonely row at the bottom of the periodic table, plus scandium and yttrium, which behave like their cousins. And despite the label, most of them are not rare at all. Cerium is more abundant in the Earth's crust than copper. Even the scarcer ones are more common than gold or platinum. The rare in rare earth does not mean there is little of it. It means something more inconvenient. It means the elements almost never gather in one place. They are scattered, thinly and stubbornly, mixed together in the same ore and chemically almost identical to one another. Nature does not hand them to you in neat veins the way it hands you iron or coal. It hands you a rock in which 17 near twins are tangled together, and then dares you to pull them apart. That single fact, dispersal, not scarcity, is the seed of the entire story. The difficulty was never in finding rare earths. It was always in separating them. So why does the world want them badly enough to fight over a customs notice? Because a handful of these elements do something no substitute can match. Neodymium, praseodymium, dysprosium, and terbium, combined with iron and boron, make the strongest permanent magnets ever manufactured. A magnet the size of a coin can lift a weight hundreds of times its own. That property, enormous magnetic force in a tiny, light package, is what makes a modern electric motor possible. And what makes it small enough to fit in a car, a drone, a wind turbine, or the wing of a fighter jet. Think of the rare earths as the vitamins of industry. You need only a trace. But without that trace, the whole system fails. A wind turbine can hold hundreds of kilograms of rare earth magnets. An electric vehicle motor depends on them. So does the hard drive spinning in a data center, the guidance fin on a precision missile, the tiny vibration motor in your phone, the color in an LED screen, the catalyst in an oil refinery. Strip the rare earth out of the modern economy, and it does not slow down. It stops. And here is the part that turns chemistry into geopolitics. Because these elements are so hard to separate, and because separating them is so dirty and so expensive, very few places on Earth are willing to do it at scale. The world does not lack rare earth deposits. They exist in the United States, Australia, Brazil, Vietnam, Greenland. What the world lacks is the will and the infrastructure to refine them. And into that gap, over 40 years, one country stepped, with a patience and a tolerance that no one else was prepared to match. To find the moment the strategy began, you have to go back to 1992, to a leader who saw a future almost no one else was looking at. Deng Xiaoping, the architect of China's economic opening, is reported to have summarized his country's ambition in a single line. "The Middle East has oil," he said. "China has rare earths." At the time, the comparison sounded almost quaint. Oil was the lifeblood of superpowers, the reason navies patrolled the Persian Gulf. Rare earths were an industrial afterthought most economists could not have defined. But Deng was not describing the world of 1992. He was describing the world he intended to build. He understood that if the future ran on advanced electronics, precision weapons, and clean energy machines, and China was betting that it would, then whoever controlled the materials inside those machines would hold a lever over everyone who made them. It was the same logic that had made oil producers powerful in the 20th century, applied to a resource the 21st century had not yet learned to fear. What followed was not an accident of geology. It was policy. Rare earths were folded into China's national plans as a strategic priority. State funding flowed into mines, into refineries, and above all, into the chemistry, the painstaking, unglamorous work of separation that everyone else found too costly to bother with. Chinese universities trained a generation of metallurgists in exactly this science. While Western companies treated rare earths as a low-margin nuisance, China treated them as a foundation. And crucially, China competed on a dimension its rivals could not or would not match. Price driven by scale, cheap energy, cheap labor, and a willingness to absorb environmental costs that regulators elsewhere would never allow. Through the 1990s and 2000s, Chinese producers flooded the global market. Prices fell, and one by one, the mines and refineries in America, in Europe, in Japan, found that they could no longer compete. They closed, not because they ran out of ore, but because they could not survive the flood. By the late 2000s, the outcome was no longer in doubt. China was mining the overwhelming majority of the world's rare earths and refining almost all of them. It had achieved something rare in modern economics, a near monopoly not over a luxury, but over a foundation of industry itself. Deng's line had stopped being a slogan. It had become an inventory. And the rest of the world was about to learn, the hard way, what it means to depend on a single supplier for the things you cannot build a future without. If the monopoly has a heart, you can find it on a map. In the arid grasslands of Inner Mongolia, north of the industrial city of Baotou, sits a place called Bayan. It is the largest known deposit of rare earths on the planet, a body of ore estimated to hold more than 40 million tons of rare earth minerals, at the height of its importance, holding a share of the world's known reserves that dwarfed everywhere else combined. What began decades ago as an iron mine turned out to be sitting on top of a chemical treasury the modern world would come to crave. Bayan is not a delicate operation. It is an enormous open pit, a terraced wound in the earth stretching across kilometers, feeding a sprawling complex of refineries in Baotou that earned the city a nickname, the rare earth capital of the world. From this single region flows a large share of the light rare earths, the neodymium and praseodymium, that become the magnets inside motors and turbines. It is one of the most concentrated points of industrial dependency anywhere on Earth. A remarkable fraction of the machines being built across the planet trace a line back to this one pit. The scale is difficult to picture until you translate it into consequence. Consider that the ore here contains not only the valuable rare earths, but also thorium, a naturally radioactive element bound up in the same rock. To get a few kilograms of usable magnet metal, you must move and chemically attack tons of ore, and everything you do not want has to go somewhere. In Baotou, much of it went into a vast artificial lake of waste. a tailings reservoir holding the residue of decades of processing, including, by some estimates, more than 70,000 tons of radioactive thorium. That lake is the hidden ledger of the monopoly. For years, it sat behind an earthen dam, unlined, its toxic and mildly radioactive slurry seeping toward the groundwater and, beyond it, toward the Yellow River, a source of drinking water for millions. Local officials acknowledged that mine waste laden with arsenic and fluorine had spread onto farmland and into water supplies. Nearby villages reported illness that fit the pattern of long-term exposure: fluorosis that damages bones and teeth, chronic poisoning from heavy metals. The magnets that make the clean energy economy possible were paid for, in part, with a landscape. This is the uncomfortable core of the whole story, and it deserves to be stated plainly, without melodrama. China did not simply outcompete the world on rare earths. It outcompeted the world in part by absorbing costs that other nations, with stricter environmental rules and less tolerance for that kind of damage, chose not to absorb. That was a decision with real human consequences, borne by real communities near Baotou. And it was also, in cold strategic terms, the price of admission to a business almost no one else was willing to enter. To understand the monopoly, you have to hold both of those truths at once. Here is the misconception that trips up almost everyone who first encounters this subject. When people imagine breaking China's grip on rare earths, they picture opening a mine. Find a deposit, dig it up, and the dependency ends. But mining is the easy part. The world is full of rare earth ore. The choke point, the real one, the one that actually matters, sits one step downstream, in a process most people have never heard of: separation. Remember that the 17 rare earths come out of the ground tangled together, chemically almost indistinguishable. To turn raw ore into the pure single elements that industry needs, you have to pull those near twins apart, one from another. The dominant method is called solvent extraction. Picture hundreds of connected tanks, called mixer settlers, in which the dissolved ore is washed back and forth between water and oil-based solvents, again and again and again. Sometimes through more than 1,000 stages, each stage nudging the elements a fraction further apart. It is slow, it is chemical intensive, and it produces streams of acidic, sometimes radioactive waste. This is the step that decides everything, and it is the step China dominates most completely. While the country mines a large majority of the world's rare earths, its share of the refining and separation, the chemistry, is even higher, estimated at around 85 to 90% of global capacity. And for the heavy rare earths, the dysprosium and terbium that make magnets survive high temperatures, China's control of processing approaches totality. Nearly all of it, worldwide, runs through Chinese plants. Why did no one else keep this capability? Partly economics. For decades, it was cheaper to simply buy the refined product from China than to build and run a separation plant at a loss. Partly environmental. The waste is genuinely difficult and expensive to handle safely, and communities in wealthy democracies do not welcome an acid and radiation facility next door. And partly knowledge, because the real expertise in running these flow sheets efficiently, tuned to a specific ore, accumulated inside Chinese companies and institutes over 30 years. You cannot simply buy that expertise. You have to grow it. So the monopoly turns out to be less about rocks and more about know-how and tolerance. A country can own a rare earth mountain and still be helpless, because owning the ore does not mean you can turn it into metal. This is why the West's rediscovered urgency has been so slow to translate into independence. Digging is a matter of months. Building the chemistry, safely, at scale, at a price that survives a Chinese price war, is a matter of years, and of a national willingness to do the dirty work. Which raises the question of how the world let this capability slip away in the first place. Because it was not always this way. Rewind to the 1980s, and the center of the rare earth world was not in China at all. It was in the Mojave Desert of California, at a mine called Mountain Pass, operated by the American company Molycorp. For a time, Mountain Pass supplied much of the planet's rare earths. The United States did not merely participate in this industry, it led it. The magnets, the processing, the science, America had all of it. And then, over roughly 2 decades, it let go. The story of how has a specific and revealing episode at its center, a company called Magnequench. Magnequench made cutting-edge neodymium magnets, the strongest in the world, and it had been born inside General Motors, with operations in Anderson and Valparaiso, Indiana. These were not toys. Magnets of this kind were used in American precision-guided weapons, in the JDAM kits that turn ordinary bombs into smart bombs, and in systems tied to the M1 Abrams tank. It was, by any honest description, a piece of the defense industrial base. In 1995, General Motors sold Magnequench. The buyer was a consortium that included two Chinese state-linked firms, which took a controlling stake for a reported $70 million. The deal came with a condition meant to protect American interests. The magnet production and its technology were to remain in the United States for at least 5 years. The condition was honored to the letter. And then, almost as soon as the 5 years expired, the American facilities were shut down, and the operation, the know-how, and the equipment was moved to China. Step back and look at what that single transaction represented. A crown jewel of magnet technology with direct military applications migrated from the American Midwest to China through an ordinary corporate sale. Approved, legal, and at the time, barely controversial. It was not stolen in the night. It was sold in daylight, one reasonable-looking business decision at a time, because the short-term logic of cost and margin pointed that way, and no one was weighing the long-term logic of dependency. Mountain Pass, meanwhile, struggled against cheap Chinese supply, and by 2002, it had stopped mining. This is the part of the story that should unsettle anyone who assumes monopolies are always seized by force. This one was, to a significant degree, handed over, not through a grand betrayal, but through the accumulated weight of decisions that each made sense in isolation. Outsource the dirty step, sell the unprofitable division, buy the cheaper import. The West did not lose the rare earth industry in a battle. It offshored it, deliberately and profitably, and only realized what it had given away when the supplier began to act like one. For a long time, the dependency was invisible because it never hurt. As long as the rare earths kept flowing at a low price, no one in Washington or Tokyo or Berlin had any reason to think about where they came from. That comfortable ignorance ended in the autumn of 2010, in the waters around a cluster of uninhabited islands in the East China Sea, the ones Japan calls the Senkaku and China calls the Diaoyu. In September 2010, a Chinese fishing trawler collided with Japanese Coast Guard vessels near those disputed islands, and Japan detained the boat's captain. What followed became a case study taught in strategy courses ever since. Shipments of rare earths from China to Japan slowed to a trickle. Whether by formal order or quiet administrative pressure, the effect was unmistakable. The country that supplied the overwhelming majority of Japan's rare earths had, at a moment of political tension, turned down the flow. For Japanese industry, this was an emergency. Japan depended on China for roughly 90% of its rare earths, and its world-leading manufacturers of cars, electronics, and motors suddenly faced the prospect of running short of a material with no easy substitute. Global prices convulsed. In the year that followed the incident, the prices of some rare earths multiplied several times over, in certain cases by roughly 10. The world discovered, all at once, that a material it had taken for granted could be squeezed, and that the hand on the valve belonged to one government. Japan's response is the instructive part, because it shows both what is possible and what is not. Tokyo poured money into alternatives. It invested in Linus, an Australian producer, to build a supply outside China. It funded recycling, stockpiling, and research into using less. Over years, Japan managed to cut its dependence meaningfully. But meaningfully is not the same as eliminated. Even after a determined, well-funded national effort, Japan remained reliant on China for a large share of the rare earths it needed. Breaking free proved to be the work of a decade, not a budget cycle. The 2010 episode was a warning shot, and the world heard it. For a while. There was a flurry of alarmed reports, some new investment, and eventually a case brought to the World Trade Organization, which in 2014 ruled against China's export restrictions. But as prices came back down and supply resumed, urgency faded. Mines that had been announced were quietly shelved. The lesson was learned, and then, in the way of these things, half forgotten. The dependency remained, waiting, and the stakes only grew. Because in the years that followed, the rare earths crept into the one place a nation can least afford to be dependent: its weapons. To grasp why defense planners lose sleep over this, you have to follow the magnets into the machinery of war. The same neodymium and samarium magnets that spin in an electric car are, in more specialized forms, embedded throughout modern military hardware. They move the control surfaces of aircraft, aim the guidance systems of missiles, drive the motors of drones, and power the sonar and propulsion of submarines. In a modern military, the rare earths are not a peripheral supply item. They are woven into the platforms themselves. The numbers make the abstraction concrete. According to figures cited by the US Department of Defense, a single F-35 stealth fighter contains on the order of 900 pounds of rare earth material. A Virginia-class attack submarine contains several tons, a figure often given as roughly 9,200 pounds. These are not gadgets bolted on at the end. They are structural to how the platforms function. And the specific elements that matter most, dysprosium and terbium, which keep magnets stable at the searing temperatures of a jet engine or a combat motor, are precisely the heavy rare earths that China processes almost exclusively. Now layer the dependency figures on top. The United States imports the overwhelming majority of the rare earths it consumes, well over 95%, and China produces close to 90% of the world's high-performance rare earth magnets, which means the American defense industrial base, the most expensive and advanced military machine ever built, rests on a class of components sourced overwhelmingly from a strategic rival. It is difficult to overstate how unusual that is. Great powers do not, as a rule, buy the guts of their weapons from the country those weapons are meant to deter. This is why the April 2025 export controls landed with such force. When Beijing required licenses for exactly the heavy rare earths and magnets that defense systems depend on, it was not an abstract trade measure. It was a demonstration, aimed at the most sensitive nerve in the Western industrial body, that the supplier understood exactly where the pressure points were. You do not need to halt shipments entirely to make the point. You only need to make everyone remember, all at once, how much they were relying on you. And the vulnerability is not only about a shooting war. It runs through the entire clean energy transition that Western governments have staked their futures on. Every wind turbine, every electric vehicle, every grid-scale motor draws on the same magnets from the same processing plants in the same country. A nation trying simultaneously to green its economy and to arm against a rival finds that both projects run through a single choke point controlled by that rival. That is not a comfortable position. It is, in fact, the exact position much of the developed world now occupies. And to keep the machines running, the monopoly reaches into places even more troubled than Baotu. There is a piece of this story that rarely makes the headlines about trade wars because it happens across a border, in a country most viewers associate with a very different kind of news. To understand it, you need one more fact about the chemistry. The heavy rare earths, the dysprosium and terbium that are most strategically precious and most tightly controlled, are not found in abundance at Bayan Obo. China's own reserves of these particular elements are limited. So where do they come from? Increasingly, they come from Myanmar. In the mountainous jungles of Kachin State, along the Chinese border, a sprawling and largely unregulated mining industry has grown up to feed China's refineries, with exactly the heavy rare earth its magnets require. The method used there, pumping chemical solutions directly into hillsides to leach the elements out, is cheap, crude, and environmentally devastating, scarring the land and poisoning the water. By recent counts, the number of mining sites in Kachin State exploded from around 130 in 2020 to at least 370 by 2025. That explosion is inseparable from Myanmar's collapse. Since the military coup of 2021, much of the country has descended into civil war, and the rare earth mining zones sit in territory contested by armed groups. The trade has become entangled with that conflict, a source of revenue in a war economy, extracted with little oversight and real human cost to the communities living around the mines. When analysts say that roughly 2/3 of China's rare earth imports, by value, come from Myanmar's heavy rare earths, they are describing a supply chain that runs through one of the most unstable regions on Earth. And that instability feeds straight back into the global price of everything built with these magnets. In the first months of 2025, as fighting disrupted the mining zones, Myanmar-origin rare earth imports into China reportedly fell by around half, and the prices of dysprosium and terbium spiked in response. A skirmish in the hills of Kachin State can ripple within weeks, into the cost of a magnet in an electric car in Europe or a component in an American missile. The chain is that tight and that fragile. For years, China's dominance of rare earths sat mostly as latent power, a capability more than an act. Then, beginning in 2023, it began to be used deliberately in a widening sequence of export controls that read, in hindsight, like a campaign learning its own strength. It started at the edges. In the summer of 2023, China imposed export licensing on gallium and germanium, not rare earths themselves, but critical minerals essential to semiconductors and defense optics, and materials China likewise dominates. The message was a probe. We can do this, and we can choose where it hurts. In December 2024, the controls sharpened, with China moving to block exports of gallium, germanium, antimony, and certain superhard materials specifically to the United States, converting a general licensing regime into a targeted denial. Each step was legal, framed in the language of national security and non-proliferation, the same language Western governments use for their own export controls on China. The tools were not new. What was new was the willingness to reach for them. Then came the escalation that defined 2025. In April, following a sharp rise in trade tensions, Beijing added the 7 heavy and medium rare earths and the magnets made from them to its export control list, the measure we began with. This was the heart of the matter, aimed squarely at the elements the West could least afford to lose. Automakers, chipmakers, and defense contractors around the world suddenly faced a licensing bottleneck on materials with no ready alternative. For a stretch of weeks, magnet shipments genuinely stalled, and factories from Germany to Japan warned of production halts. The final turn of the screw came in October 2025, and it was the most sweeping of all. China announced rules that reached far beyond its own borders, asserting that any product made anywhere in the world would require a Chinese license if it contained even a tiny fraction, a threshold reported around 0.1% of Chinese origin rare earths, or if it was made using Chinese processing technology. In one stroke, Beijing claimed a veto over a vast swath of global manufacturing, extending its control not just over the raw material, but over anything, anywhere built with it. It is worth being precise about what this is and is not. It is the assertive use of a genuine market position through the ordinary machinery of export law, the same machinery every major economy operates. It is not, on the evidence, some secret plot. It is announced policy, published and explicit. But it is also, unmistakably, the transformation of an industrial supply chain into an instrument of statecraft. The question the rest of the world faced was no longer whether the dependency existed. It was what, if anything, could be done about it, and who stood to gain or lose as the scramble began. So follow the money, because the monopoly is not only a strategic asset, it is an enormously lucrative one, and understanding the economics explains a great deal about the behavior. The rare earth magnet market, small in tonnage, is vast in leverage. The magnets themselves anchor a market measured in billions of dollars, and the products that depend on them, electric vehicles, wind farms, consumer electronics, weapons, represent trillions. Whoever controls the pinch point in that chain controls the pricing power over everything downstream. And the pricing power is real and visible. When supply tightened through 2025, the price of neodymium praseodymium oxide, the key magnet feedstock, climbed sharply, sitting late in the year in the range of $120,000 to $130,000 per ton, up nearly 30% in a single year. For producers inside the controlled system, scarcity is not a problem to be solved. It is a source of margin. A monopolist does not necessarily want to sell as much as possible. Sometimes it wants to sell exactly enough to keep customers dependent and prices high. This is also why China's dominance has proven so durable against would-be competitors. Every time a Western rare earth project has gotten close to viability, it has faced the same threat. That Chinese producers could, if they chose, flood the market and drive prices below the newcomer's cost of production, exactly as happened to Mountain Pass in the early 2000s. The mere possibility of a price war is enough to frighten away private investment. Why build an expensive, dirty separation plant when the dominant producer could make it unprofitable overnight? The monopoly defends itself not only with what it does, but with what everyone fears it could do. There is a deeper structural advantage too. Because China occupies every rung of the ladder, mining, refining, magnet making, and the manufacturing that uses the magnets, it captures value at each step and gathers unmatched knowledge along the way. A competitor who masters only mining still has to sell into a Chinese-controlled processing market. A competitor who masters only processing still has to buy ore and sell magnets into a Chinese-dominated ecosystem. Vertical integration turns the monopoly from a single wall into a series of them, each one reinforcing the next. Which is why breaking it is not a matter of one clever investment or one new mine. It requires rebuilding an entire industrial stack: mine, refinery, magnet plant, and the skilled workforce to run all three, in the teeth of a competitor who can undercut you at any stage, and who has a 30-year head start on the hardest parts. It is the kind of project that markets, left alone, will not fund, because the rational private calculation always points toward dependence. And that realization has forced a change that would have been unthinkable a generation ago: governments stepping directly into the business of magnets. The most dramatic sign of that change came in the summer of 2025, and it involved the same California mine where this story began. Mountain Pass had been revived years earlier by a company called MP Materials, which had restarted mining, but still, for a time, shipped much of its concentrate to China for the very processing the West could not do at scale. In July 2025, the United States government did something that cut against decades of free market orthodoxy. The Department of Defense took a direct equity stake in the company, agreeing to buy $400 million of preferred stock and becoming its largest shareholder. The terms reveal how seriously Washington had come to take the threat. Alongside the equity, the deal included a loan and commitments from major banks toward construction financing. Most tellingly, it set a price floor, a guarantee that MP would receive a minimum price for its magnet material, well above recent market levels, explicitly to neutralize the threat of a Chinese price war. It committed the company to build magnet-making capacity on American soil and to supply a fixed tonnage for a decade. And it pushed MP to exit its sales to China. This was industrial policy, unapologetic and direct, the state underwriting a supply chain that the market would not build on its own. MP Materials is not alone in the scramble. Australia's Lynas remains the most significant rare earth producer and separator outside China, operating processing facilities in Malaysia and expanding into the heavy rare earths that matter most. Governments across the developed world have moved to build strategic stockpiles, fund recycling, and back new projects, from Estonia to Texas. International agencies have urged nations to treat rare earths the way they once treated oil, with reserves, with contingency plans, with the assumption that supply can be cut. Even by some projections, China's share of refining could ease towards 70% by the mid-2030s, as this investment slowly matures. But it is essential to be honest about the timeline and the odds. Building a rare earth supply chain from mine to magnet takes the better part of a decade, and much of the hardest knowledge still resides in China. Environmental permitting in democracies is slow by design. The workforce has to be trained almost from scratch, and the whole enterprise remains exposed at every stage to the price weapon. The West is not on the verge of independence. It is, at best, at the beginning of a long and expensive climb, with no guarantee of reaching the top. Which naturally raises the conditional question that hangs over every defense ministry and boardroom watching this unfold: the what happens if? What happens if, before that climb is complete, the supply is cut in earnest? Not as a warning, not for a few weeks, but as a sustained act of pressure during a genuine crisis. The honest answer is that no one fully knows, because it has never been tested at that scale. But the outlines are visible, and they are sobering. Stalled factories, grounded production lines, weapons programs slowed for want of a magnet. The entire recent scramble is, in effect, an attempt to make sure that question is never answered the hard way. And then, at the very moment the pressure peaked, it appeared to release. In late October 2025, the American and Chinese presidents met in Busan, South Korea, and reached a broad trade truce. As part of it, in early November, China announced that it would suspend its most sweeping rare earth controls, the October measures with the global reach, for 1 year, through November of 2026. Markets exhaled. Headlines declared the crisis over. For a moment, it looked as though the monopoly's most aggressive weapon had been holstered. But read the fine print, and the truce looks less like peace and more like a pause. The suspension applied to the newest and broadest controls, not to everything. The April 2025 licensing regime, the one covering the 7 heavy rare earths and the magnets defense systems depend on, was never suspended at all. It remained in force, quietly, beneath the good news. In other words, the most strategically important lever stayed exactly where it was. What China gave back was the maximalist overreach of October. What it kept was the pressure point that mattered most. Then came a reminder that a truce is not a resolution. In June 2026, Beijing added 2 American rare earth companies, MP Materials, the Pentagon's own flagship investment, and USA Rare Earth, to its export control blacklist. The message could hardly have been more pointed. The very champions the United States was funding to escape the monopoly were singled out for restriction by the monopoly itself. The suspension of the broad controls and the targeting of specific Western competitors were happening at the same time. Leverage applied with precision, even as the headline tension eased. This is the rhythm the world now lives with. Not a single dramatic embargo, but a cycle. Tighten, threaten, ease, target, repeat. That keeps everyone dependent and everyone uncertain. Each round teaches the same lesson the 2010 Senkaku crisis first taught, only louder. That the flow can be adjusted, that the adjustment is a choice, and that the choice belongs to someone else. The suspension buys time, it does not buy independence, and the clock on that 1-year window is already running down. So the situation as it stands is not resolved. It is suspended, in every sense of the word. The West is racing to build alternatives that are years away from maturity, while the leverage that prompted the race remains, for now, largely intact and demonstrably ready to be used. The monopoly has not been broken. It has, if anything, been revealed, pulled out of the obscurity where it lived for 40 years and set down in the middle of the geopolitical table for everyone to see. And once a thing like that is seen, it cannot be unseen. Step back from the timeline, and a larger pattern comes into view, one that reaches well beyond rare earths. What this story really documents is the hidden cost of a certain kind of efficiency. For 40 years, the global economy optimized relentlessly for one thing: the lowest price. Outsource the dirty step, buy from the cheapest supplier, close the plant that cannot compete. Every one of those choices was rational on its own terms, and together they produced a world of extraordinary abundance and extraordinary fragility. The rare earths are simply the clearest example of a bargain the developed world made again and again, often without noticing it was making one. In exchange for cheap magnets, cheap electronics, and cheap clean energy hardware, it accepted a concentration of control it would never have accepted deliberately. No parliament ever voted to hand a strategic monopoly to a rival. It emerged, transaction by transaction, from a million individually sensible decisions. The same way Magna Quench crossed the Pacific, the same way Mountain Pass fell silent, the same way an entire industry drifted to the other side of the world, while everyone was looking at the quarterly numbers. And the cost of that bargain does not show up until the moment of leverage arrives. For decades, the dependency was free. The rare earths flowed, the prices were low, and the arrangement looked like nothing but a good deal. The bill only comes due when the supplier decides to present it. And by then, the dependency is structural, embedded in every factory and weapons program and power grid, far too deep to unwind in the time a crisis allows. That is the nature of this kind of vulnerability. It is invisible, right up until it is decisive. There is a broader lesson here about resilience versus efficiency, and it applies to far more than 17 elements. A supply chain optimized purely for cost is, almost by definition, optimized for fragility, stripped of the redundancy, the spare capacity, and the domestic know-how that cost money in good times and save you in bad ones. The rare earth story is now forcing governments to relearn something their grandparents understood about strategic materials: that sometimes the most expensive thing you can buy is the cheapest possible supplier. And the price is not paid in dollars, it is paid in dependence. Whether the West has truly learned that lesson, or has merely been frightened by it for a news cycle, is the open question. The investments are real. The Pentagon's stake in a mining company is real. The stockpiles and the subsidies and the new plants are real. But so is the pull of the old logic, the eternal temptation, once the crisis fades and prices fall, to quietly go back to buying the cheap thing from the efficient supplier, and to forget, again, what that efficiency really costs. The rare earths have been forgotten once before. The whole question now is whether they will be forgotten a second time. So we return to where we began, to that short notice on a government website in April 2025, and the strange power packed into 7 names most people cannot pronounce. By now, that notice should look different. It was not a bureaucratic footnote. It was the visible tip of 40 years of strategy, geology, chemistry, and quiet accumulation. A moment when a dependency that had been building since Deng Xiaoping's era briefly broke the surface and let the world see what it had been standing on all along. The rare earths are, in the end, a lesson about the things we don't look at. We build our lives on layers of infrastructure we never see. The elements in the magnet in the motor in the machine, and we assume the bottom layer will always be there. This story is what happens when someone reaches down and puts a hand on that bottom layer, and everything above it holds its breath. The phone in your pocket, the car in the driveway, the turbine on the ridge, the jet overhead. All of them rest on a shelf that, for now, one country largely controls. None of this means the future is written. Monopolies have been broken before. Industries have been rebuilt. Dependencies that looked permanent have been unwound with enough money, time, and political will. The scramble now underway is real, and it may yet succeed. But it will take a decade of sustained effort against a determined competitor, and it will require the one thing that democracies find hardest to sustain: attention, held steady long after the crisis that provoked it has passed. The rare earths will test whether that attention can last. If this is the kind of story you want more of, the hidden machinery underneath the headlines, the follow the money and follow the material investigations into how power actually works, then consider subscribing. And share this with someone who still thinks the important resources are the ones we argue about on the news. Leave a comment telling us which choke point you want us to trace next. The chips, the shipping lanes, the fertilizer, the cobalt. There is a whole hidden architecture holding up the modern world, and we are only just beginning to map it. Because the deepest truth of the rare earth monopoly is not about China, and it is not about magnets. It is about how easily the most important things become invisible. How a civilization can build itself on a foundation it never chose to examine, and only discover the foundation when someone else's hand is resting on it. The elements were always there, scattered in the rock, waiting. The question the next decade will answer is not whether they matter. It is who decides when they flow, and who is left holding their breath when they stop.